Hello and welcome back to Kilmainham Jail for another Kilmainham Jail on Lockdown video. This is part 3 of this series that we're doing on the Invincibles and the events that took place in Kilmainham Jail and Courthouse in 1883. In the last video, we were looking at Inspector John Mallon, the police officer who was in charge of investigating the killing of Lord Frederick Cavendish and T.H. Burke in the Phoenix Park on the 6th of May 1882, and how he used this building to break Miles Kavanagh, one of the 2 getaway drivers after the killings took place. So when Kavanagh went and confessed in the courthouse next door, this was deeply unsettling for the rest of the Invincibles. He wasn't the first person to inform on the group, but as a getaway driver, he was the one closest to the heart of the conspiracy. And a lot of the men became worried, not just because of his testimony and how damning it was, but also they began to worry about who might be next. And Inspector Mallon really played on these fears and began to sow seeds of doubt amongst the group and convince them that other members of the conspiracy were about to turn and testify to save their own skins. And many of the men began to wonder maybe the best thing for them to do was to do exactly that and save themselves. And Inspector Mallon had his sights set on probably the biggest fish, which was James Carey. Carey was the man who had, set up the Invincibles here in Dublin and basically masterminded the killings in the Phoenix Park in 1882. Now, we don't know where they kept the Invincibles in 1883 during this period. Maybe it would make sense that they would have been here in the East Wing. It's the most modern, it's the most secure, and if any of you have ever been here, you might have noticed that some of the cells here on the ground floor have extra strong locks. These were added in 1865 when the Fenians were held in Kilmainham Jail. So maybe this is as good a place as any to think about what it was like to be a prisoner and one of the Invincibles in 1883. All cells are pretty much the same. They're all of a standard size in the Victorian era. Now, according to the French journalist, a man called Bussy, Bussy wrote a biography of the career of Inspector Mallon. And he said that James Carey was placed in a cell like this. And one evening, the spy hole, which was normally used by the guards to check on the prisoners, it was left slightly ajar so he could look outside, and he heard this commotion of people walking outside his cell carrying papers, and he could just about make them out. He eventually worked out that one of them was Inspector Mallon, and then he heard from next door one of them demand that he be brought a table, a chair, some paper, some pens and some blotting paper, giving the impression that somebody was giving some kind of a testimony that had to be written down. So Carey apparently became very agitated because he needed to know who was in the cell next door that was talking to Inspector Mallon. Now, when Carey had come to Kilmainham Jail, he had been more or less assigned a prison guard, but it turned out that prison guard was not a guard at all. He was actually a police detective, and he had, to a certain extent, won Carey's trust. So Carey demanded off him who was next door, and eventually this guard whispered to him that it was Daniel Curley, and Carey was convinced that Curley, another member of the Invincibles, had confessed. At the same time, Mallon was also working on James Carey's wife, telling her that other members of the group were confessing, and that if Carey wanted to save himself, he needed to get in there first and give as much information as possible. So, who was next door? Who was in the cell next door to James Carey? And Carey saw not just Mallon, but also the chief solicitor, John Bolton, pass by his cell. And actually, the cell beside him was completely empty. The whole thing was a ruse organised by Mallon, and he convinced then Carey to confess. And as I said, that was a big scalp, I suppose, because Carey was at the centre of it. He was the conspiracy in lots of ways. And when he turned up then among the witnesses next door in Kilmainham jail, you can imagine the consternation that caused amongst the group, the fact that their leader essentially had betrayed them. So that's it for part 3. In part 4, we'll be looking at the outcome of the trials and the executions that took place here in Kilmainham in 1883. So until then, stay safe, and we'll talk to you soon.